Hello, everybody. Good morning. Lovely to see you all. I think I know lots of you in the room, but for those of you that I don't, my name's Callum. I'm the Impact Lead for the Sustainable Food Places program, which broadly means my role is to help you as a network, but us as a program, think about how we evidence our value added, how we sort of use data and evidence to show that we're doing good work. And that really is what we're going to be talking about today in this session. We're going to be looking at the sort of concepts of monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and thinking about how we can apply them to the work of food partnerships to do that sort of evidencing of work. I'm based at an organization called Food Matters, and one of the things that we do at Food Matters is help predominantly food organizations, but also non-food organizations evaluate that work. Excuse me, I'll give myself a bit of a cough. So this is coinciding with the release of a new toolkit that we're coming out certainly in the next couple of weeks, possibly at the end of next week, which will take you into more detail into some of the concepts that we're going to be starting to explore today. We're going to be covering quite a lot of ground in the next hour, so sort of apologies for that. There's going to be lots of concepts that are going to be introduced, but yeah, as I say, the toolkit will help you explore those in more detail. It is a big topic, this sort of idea of monitoring, evaluation, learning. Thankfully, there are loads of really fantastic online resources that can help you explore them in more detail. So I'm going to be signposting throughout. We'll be sharing the slides, of course, afterwards. You'll see on some of the slides as we start to go through that there's various resources that are signposted there for you to be able to go and explore them a little bit further. So we'll start off with some, oh, my screen's not moving forward, there it is. We'll start off with some jargon busting in terms of these concepts, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, as well as this concept of theories of change. Some of you might already be really familiar with this kind of work, so apologies if I'm repeating old ground there, but I always like to start these sessions just getting us all on the same page when it comes to sort of some of the concepts, because we'll be using those concepts throughout the remainder of the session. The bulk of that session, of this session, will focus on thinking very specifically about the role of food partnerships, and actually more specifically the role of a coordinator in particular, and thinking about some of the added challenges that we have in our work, working both as a partnership, so working with partners to deliver our impact, but also that very tricky task that we have of trying to bring about systems level change and all the complexities that are involved in that. So that's going to be what we'll focus on in the second section, and hopefully we'll give you some sort of some good tools and at least ways of thinking about things that can help you progress that in your work. So hopefully by the end of the session you'll have an introductory understanding to these concepts of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Know where to go for some more information to explore it in more depth, and then have hopefully some real practical tools and approaches to thinking about your work very specifically in a food partnership and as a food partnership coordinator. Righto, so let's go ahead and jump in then. So monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Well, what is it? Well, in its simplest way, it's a way of asking some questions about our work. So it's a way of thinking about, well, what it is that we're doing, or perhaps what it is that we're planning to do, thinking through some of those reasons of why it is that we're doing those things, perhaps some of those sort of assumptions that we have of why it is we're doing something and what it might lead to, but then asking questions of, well, is what we're doing working? Is it delivering the things that we want it to deliver? And how can we improve that process? And so monitoring, evaluation, learning is sort of like this package of approaches, if you like, that tries to help us answer those questions. Gives us a whole sort of set of tools. It's a bit like a toolkit of being able to pull things out, pull approaches out, and answer those questions of, what it is we're doing, why are we doing it, is it working, and how do we improve on it? And of course, it's an acronym, MEL. It's all sorts of acronyms. I see a new acronym, I swear, most days. You might have heard it as MEAL, which includes accountability as well into that, which I've just left off for simplicity's sake, but we can touch on that as well. But broadly speaking, it covers these concepts of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So we'll start with monitoring, being that's the real-time ongoing monitoring of what it is that you're doing, of the activity as it unfolds. So of your sort of daily activity within a project. It's that how do we keep track and how do we mark progress on that kind of immediate deliverables, the implementation of things? So that can be in terms of project resources that are being used and unfolding. It can be those activities, but it's also about starting to sort of make notes of whether we're achieving our implementation goals. So throughout, I'll use some examples from my work. So one of the, for us, the monitoring would be, are we delivering a workshop? So we say we're going to deliver 5 workshops. Monitoring will be saying, yes, we're delivering workshop today, and perhaps we'll get some feedback, and that feedback is looking good. So that's the context from sort of my work and today's session. So it's that, what's happening now? What's the real-time performance that we're seeing? Whereas the evaluation is our opportunity to sort of take a little bit of a step back from that and say, okay, we've started to collect this data for our monitoring work. Is it really doing what we want it to do? And the way that we start that process is realizing that the work that we do comes with all sorts of values. In charitable work or food partnership work and whatever it might be, we do things for a reason. We do things for a reason because we want things to change. We want something to improve. So evaluation allows us to combine the data that we're collecting in the monitoring part, that real-time activity, and combine it with essentially what we want to see happening. So we say, is that data actually doing what we want to see happening? And evaluation and the approaches in that is that toolkit for allowing us to combine those two things: real-time data with our assumptions and our aspirations for what we want to see change in the world. And then the accountability aspects on top of that, which I said I would mention. Of course, if we're monitoring, if we're collecting our data, if we're understanding what we're delivering, and if we're delivering it well, then we have an ability to be accountable, both to our funders, but to our stakeholders or to whoever else it might be, because we're able to prove through those approaches that we are actually doing what we wanted to do and what we set out to do and what we said we would do. And then, of course, it's no good doing all that data collection and all that evaluation if we're not going to actually, use that, whether we use it to help us make the case, which, of course, is a lot of what my work focuses on, but also, of course, to help us adapt, that ability to be able to understand what we're delivering, understand where it's going well and where it's not going so well, gives us that opportunity to be able to learn from that and improve. There's lots of different types of evaluation, and this is where we start to delve ever so slightly into the rabbit hole, but just wanted to touch upon some of those key terms, because you might hear them if you start to engage with sort of more evaluation work. So I thought it'd be useful just to cover quickly what some of them mean. So broadly speaking, we can talk about different types of evaluations being formative or summative. Formative is that sort of focus a bit more like on the monitoring aspects of things, where we're trying to make improvements to the work. So as it's unfolding, we're trying to make tweaks, we're trying to improve that process, adapt as we go along. Whereas summative is a bit more of that, okay, let's stop and have a little look at things. Let's find specific moments to, whether that's the middle of a project or perhaps at the end of the project, to ask whether this is going well. Should we continue this, or should we perhaps stop this intervention? This is also then combined with 2 other types, process evaluation and impact evaluation. And you're probably more and more hearing about impact evaluation because it's really grown in the field, certainly in the last 10 years. Process evaluation is then that focusing on, well, at least how I like to think about it, is the nuts and bolts of your work. So it's that implementation aspect of things. Are we doing it as well as we could be? Is it effective? Is it efficient? Is it cost effective? It's that focus on the real delivery aspects of our work. Whereas impact evaluation is actually saying, are we really heading in the right direction with all this? It's one thing, we might be really efficient, for example, and this is a poor example to use in our field, I realize, but you might be really efficient at cutting down a forest, and everyone's really good at it, and everyone's really worked out, like the team's working really together, but then you might find out that you're cutting down the wrong forest. And that's what impact evaluation is about. It's about saying, are we actually ultimately heading in a direction that is having the impact that we want? And of course, we inevitably combine these different types of evaluation, and all of them are really important. And they're all, of course, interlinked. We need to be able to think about the nuts and bolts of our work, and what that sort of general direction that we're heading towards through our efforts. So, okay, that's evaluation, that's MEL, that's MEAL, whatever acronym you want to use. Well, then how do we do it? And this is where, of course, it inevitably becomes slightly more complex and well, you can there's so much information out there. There's so many different approaches to how you can think about doing an evaluation of your project. And the reason for that is because good evaluation requires it to be very specific to, well, one, what you're trying to evaluate, and two, the very unique circumstances of what it is that your context that you work in. Just on the right hand side, just to give some example of just how many approaches there are a huge amount of approaches, and you'll see throughout. One of the resources that I use a lot is called Better Evaluation, and it has a huge number of free resources to help you think about the different approaches that might make sense to you, and it will give you a lot more information around those and what might be of value. So unfortunately, we won't have time to sort of it takes a whole course to go through all these different approaches, but really just a signpost that when you're thinking about starting to do an evaluation, do go and check out Better Evaluation and explore some of their guides that can take you through thinking through those steps. But just to introduce one of those approaches quickly, so in terms of how do you do an evaluation, well, there's a sort of a series of steps which are useful to think about. This is, again, a Better Evaluation resource. It's called the Rainbow Framework, and I use it daily in my work as an evaluator. It's just a step-by-step approach to thinking through what's required in that evaluation process. And we'll fly through them here quickly just to introduce them, because there's a couple of key points that I think are worth highlighting. And the first one being just to say that, an evaluation process, it does take time, it does take resources, and it needs to be managed. So there needs to be some early decision making about who's going to do it. So in your partnership context, there needs to be a conversation at a steering group level, perhaps around the different functions and different roles within that evaluation process, and the reality of what that requires. So in terms of resources, both time and money and efforts that are involved in that. Next stage, of course, is to define the project. And here I'm introducing another sort of jargon busting term that we're going to look at in just a second, this idea of theory of change. To be able to evaluate something, you really need to have a strong grasp of what it is you're doing and why it is that you're doing it. And that's where a theory of change comes in. We're going to look at that in just a second. Need to be clear about what we're evaluating, so we can start to use evaluation questions. If you've done any research, it's a very similar thing. You need to have those, what is it that we're ultimately looking to evaluate? And this is where those values start to come into the equation. This describe section is that retrieving of data and analysis. Much of this you'll be familiar with. You've done surveys, no doubt, in the past. You've done interviews and that kind of thing. But again, a whole range of tools available on Better Evaluation to think through the other options that you have, that data collection analysis. This point is an important one to touch upon, because we're going to be talking about this a lot in the next section, because certainly when we're doing impact evaluation, it's no good just collecting the data and starting to analyze it. We want to be able to prove that our role was meaningful in that process. We're seeing some positive outcomes. How can we start to show that we, as a food partnership, played a critical role in making that happen? So that's that kind of cause and effect element that becomes very important in impact evaluation. As I said, we're going to cover that more in much more depth in just a few moments' time. Opportunity to bring together those different data sources. And then, of course, you need to be able to talk about it. You need to be able to communicate it. And it's a really important part, of course, of any evaluation process, is to be able to not just learn from it, but think about the ways in which we can effectively communicate that added value. So let's just continue on that jargon busting theme and have a look at this idea of a theory of change. And I wanted to preface this, I guess, with saying that I'll say it's actually a few times, I think, in this session, but one of the things would be great if you walk away from this webinar with, if you haven't engaged with a theory of change process at your partnership, you might have done, but if you haven't, I really couldn't recommend more strongly, really, that it's a super important thing to do. And it's one of those ones that I kind of feel like is shrouded in mysticism, but it's actually very simple. It really is thinking through that sort of logical causal chain of what we do on the ground, what we expect that to result in, and what those kind of impacts that we're looking for that to ultimately lead to. You call that a causal chain model or a logic model. So it's thinking about how the work that we do, whether it's a project, whether it's a program, a policy, or a strategy, how we're assuming that there's going to be a chain of results that happen that lead to the eventual impacts that we're looking to bring about. And there's a few concepts in there that I want to just to highlight, because we're going to continue to use them throughout the rest of this webinar. So these activities to outputs to outcomes and impacts. And I think there's often sort of confusion, and some of these seem very similar, and they are ultimately. So I thought it'd be helpful just to give a little bit of a clarity, perhaps, on those different things. So activities, I mean, probably the most self-explanatory of them all is what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. It's the work that's happening on the ground. Whereas the outputs then are the what's being produced because of that. So again, to use the example from my work, the activity is me currently delivering this workshop to you. And the output of that is going to be a completed workshop, one completed workshop out of a series of others. And then we have these two other components, outcomes and then the impact. And this, I think, is where sometimes sort of blurring or confusion can come about. I like to think about the outcomes as sort of the shorter term, real results of what you're doing. So to give an example from this workshop, if the activities is me delivering it, the outputs is the completion of the workshop, the outcomes, hopefully, is that you will leave this webinar feeling more confident around applying some of this evaluation ideas to the nature of your work. So it's those kind of shorter term goals of what we hope to happen as a result of our activities and the outputs of those activities. Whereas the impact then is that longer term, bigger picture changes that might not necessarily be quite so directly related to those initial activities and outputs, but it's those bigger changes that we want to see in the world. So again, to use that example, if the outcomes of this activity are for you to go away and feel a little bit more confident with evaluation in relation to food partnership working, well, the impact of that hopefully is that food partnerships will become better funded, because we're able to evidence our value on a bigger sense. We're going to have more buy-in from stakeholders, and ultimately we're going to start bringing about some of those food systems changes that we're looking to do. So you can see then that sort of causal chain that brings it about. One of the reasons that it's really useful to go away and do this for your food partnership is because it becomes a product. So we'll go look at an example of what comes out of this process in a second. But the process is just as valuable as what comes out of it. Sitting down with yourself but doing it collaboratively with your steering group, of thinking through with great attention to detail those individual steps that are involved, what you're doing it, why you're doing it, and how you think that will ultimately lead to that impact. And one of the simplest ways of doing this is by using something like this. This is all will be shared, of course, in the toolkit. This is a template that you can go away and use directly. This is an example of that kind of very simple causal chain where we're looking at the different, we've got the outcomes here, we're looking at the impact we're expecting, and we're linking those to the activities. And from that, and this is where we'll start to use it, when you start to have that clear causal chain, you start to understand what it is that is important for you to measure. You start to see what indicators, what measurements are useful for you to be able to show that you're doing those things, both in terms of the delivery of that work, so the outputs, but also, and again, we'll look at this in a lot more detail, what some of those indicators are that you're heading towards that larger scale impact that you're looking to deliver. So this is just one model, one way of doing it. It's kind of the most simplistic way. It's the way that I like to get people started. It doesn't have to be that. And you can approach a theory of change in all sorts of different ways, as long as you're sort of thinking through that causal chain. And just to show a couple of examples then, this is our one that we use at the Sustainable Food Places for the last 5 years, this last phase for us at SFP. Slightly different approaches, a different approach to the way we're doing it. But again, that's thinking through that causal chain. And this, a draft version that Hannah Fenton kindly shared with me of Good Food Oxfordshire's theory of change that they're working on currently. So this is just a draft at the moment, but again, a different way of approaching it. But still focusing on what they're doing and what changes they expect to bring about in the world, as well as some of those values that we talked about at the start, in terms of being clear as to why it is that they're doing what they're doing, and what they expect to see come out of that. So that's a theory of change then. As I say, do please, if you haven't got one, I really recommend going away and doing it. It really can add a lot of clarity to your work, but also provides a really, really strong foundation to being able to apply this to the work of food partnerships, and being able to address some of the problems that we're going to be talking about in the next section. Yes, apologies.
There's a good question in the chat. So I don't know if you want to address that now, about the difference between vision and impact.
Okay, sure. I mean, I guess the way that I would look at that difference is that the vision is aspirational, whereas the impact we're talking about here, we're trying to get to that point of being able to see whether that vision has come to fruition, I guess. But I guess, if we're looking, you can also think about impact as being aspirational, I suppose, in terms of, that's the aspiration that we want to bring about that impact. So that relationship between a vision statement and your impact are intrinsically linked. And that's a good way of thinking about your impact or your impact aspiration, is by thinking about that initial vision that you've established. And that can form, perhaps the most overarching impact that you want to bring about. And then perhaps from that vision statement, you're able to break that down a little bit further and think about some of those sort of more specific aspects of that, maybe in relation to specific aspects of the food system, health, environment, governance, whatever it might be. Any other questions, Andrea, before we move on to the next section?
No, that just seemed useful to answer right away.
Great. No, thank you for that, Andrea. And do keep. I can't see the chat actually, so do let me know if there's anything else that I should be aware of. Righto. So yeah, I wanted to do a bit of jargon busting. As I say, a real whistle-stop tour, and apologies for that. Please go away and have a look at the resources to explore it more. But I wanted to sooner rather than later get to the idea of, okay, what does that mean for our work directly? Because we have a slightly more difficult context, I would say, than a lot of people do in this realm. And the reason for that is what I call, and which is just an internal term, but I call the twin attribution problem. There's the attribution problem is well known sort of in evaluation circles. It's that question of, how do you identify cause and effect? How do you say that what you've done directly has led to some kind of measurable change? So that's well known, but we have that kind of a dual nature of that problem in our work. The first one being that we, by our nature of our work in partnership. All of our impact as a food partnership, and certainly as a coordinator, tends to come from the impact of our partners. We have impact through our partners by nature of working in a partnership. So that sort of, there's a bit of a blurring of lines between roles and responsibility. And we've had a historic problem of knowing that we're doing good work, knowing that we're delivering impact, but struggling to prove it. Knowing that our partners' work is better because we exist, and they're doing more because we exist, but struggling to really evidence what our role was in that process. So that's one element of it. The other element of it, of course, is that we're trying to address these very complex systems level problems that are defined by their nature, by unpredictable dynamics, by complex feedback loops, by lots of stakeholders working across lots of different systems, where an intervention or an activity that you do, it can be really difficult to say, well, actually, we know that this is having a kind of a profound influence on different sectors, perhaps in quite subtle ways, but we're not really able to document, again, that causal mechanism, that effect of what we're doing. We're able to perhaps collect data on what we're doing, but how do we evaluate our work and say, yes, we're achieving these goals? How are we evaluating and showing that because of our partnership, partners are working better together and doing more? How are we able to show that because of our partnership, we're bringing about those systems level changes? And that's what we're going to focus on now, is how do we start to do that? And at Sustainable Food Places, we've been going through a bit of a learning journey ourselves, because it's quite frontier, all this stuff. There's lots of people that are working on how we do this. And we're trying to sort of be leaders on this and work with you to be leaders on this. And the way that we've started it, and you'll see why I spent some time talking about a theory of change before, is because we started with the theory of change. And you can start a theory of change in different ways. You can start with the impact and you can think about your vision, or you can start with the sort of nuts and bolts of, well, what is it that we actually do and why is it that we do it? So that's what we did. We spent quite a lot of time going through all the resources that many of you have submitted to us over the 10 years, including the reporting data that you submitted to us, but also your awards applications, to really start to narrow down on what it is that food partnerships do. Where is that space for added value? What are we bringing to that space? And from that review, this is a word cloud that came from that, and we started to pull out some of those key kind of work areas. And you'll see a few of them here. It's that kind of networking, convening, it's connecting, it's brokering, it's sharing and amplifying. What you might notice from these words is that these are sort of what you might think about as kind of being soft skills. They're kind of the intangibles. They're the things that we know are really important to do, that connecting and convening, but they're not really that easy to sort of to measure in any kind of traditional sense. They're very fluid, they're very nuanced. And certainly our experience, or my experience, especially working with you, with food partnership coordinators, alas, I think a lot of people often really undervalue some of this work that they do. They don't necessarily think about it from an impact perspective. Some of those subtle things that you do that actually are from my perspective, the raison d'etre, the reason to be of a food partnership, that very clever, very nuanced, bringing people together, convening, connecting. And we call that, of course, many of you might be familiar with now, we call that the backbone function. This idea that what a food partnerships role isn't necessarily direct delivery, although you'll notice deliver is there. It's about that bringing together. It's about that supporting of a broader network to bring about that change. So what we've developed from that is a bit of an impact framework, or at least a way of thinking about how we can start grouping different aspects of our activity as a food partnership. So we took all those different soft skills that we highlighted in that last one, and we grouped them together to create a bit of a framework for thinking about how we can categorize the different areas of our activity. And the reason we've done that largely is because it allows us then to acknowledge the very important significance of these different areas of work. So, and there's still room for things being missing, and some of our work might not fit into all these categories. It's very much a development process, but we've come out with these 5. So, of course, at the top, food partnerships do deliver things in their own right, in a more conventional, traditional way, as a charity might do, as a local authority might do. We deliver our own projects and programs independently, but also in collaboration, so directly involving ourselves in food work. And for this section, some of those earlier aspects of monitoring and evaluation are much more easily applied, because we're able to measure things in tangible ways for those. Things delivered, projects delivered, people reached, food parcels distributed, that kind of thing. But for the other aspects, these are the more soft skill ones. So, of course, we coordinate action, don't we? We coordinate action across the food system. We share knowledge. We connect stakeholders across sectors, across regions. It's a really important convening role that we play. But we also influence work. We influence local decision-making. We help design strategy. We help influence strategy. We help it become more inclusive and representative. But we also influence the hearts and minds of local people through our campaigning, through our public engagement. We also instigate work, and this one's always a bit of a trickier one to pinpoint, but and I'm talking to lots of coordinators, this is a key thing, and again, that kind of intangible is we might not necessarily always be involved in the delivery of work or even the coordination of it, but we know that that work probably wouldn't have happened if we weren't there and we didn't make those connections. Part of that is about mobilizing funding, which of course lots of food partnerships do, but also identifying those gaps and having the experience and knowledge to be able to identify those gaps, and then bringing people together to be able to fill those gaps. And then on that last one, we also amplify the work of others by sharing and promoting the work of others, of our partners. We platform things, we share and we celebrate. And through that, we help to build that local good food movement that we know is also important. So I was having a really interesting conversation again with Hannah Fenton from Good Food Oxfordshire just last week, and she pointed me to some resources that I've just started to include here. It's from an organization called Collective Impact. Highly recommend you go and have a look at that, because they have a very similar framework that they've developed, which covers these points. And the emphasis here is about that aspect of soft skills, and now really starting to acknowledge their importance and significance, and crucially, thinking about how we can measure and how we can document these things, because we must do that. We must measure and document, because this is how we deliver our impact as a food partnership, through these more nuanced approaches, as well as, of course, more conventional approaches of delivery of own projects and programs. So what are the outputs then? If we think back through that theory of change model, we've talked a bit about the activity. Our activity can be grouped into that framework. Well, what are the outputs? Well, of course, we talked in the delivery section. Well, they're more, they can be more conventional, if you like. But with the coordinate section, well, we need to think about those connections we make and noting those connections we make. we need to think about when we create cross-sectoral bridges, when we bring civil society actors and we connect them with local authority actors, we need to think about the new partners that we've engaged. And crucially, we need to record those connections that we've made. Same for influence. We need to think about those more obvious. Okay, it's great if we've participated or we've actually designed a local policy, but we also have maybe influenced things in more subtle ways. Maybe we've reached out to a councillor, maybe we've talked to an MP, maybe we've mobilized citizenry around some policy decision. Maybe with the instigated, we've helped to seed that project. Maybe we've mobilized some funding. Maybe we shared some knowledge that led to a knowledge gap being filled. And maybe for Amplify, maybe it's about talking about what we've platformed, what sort of work we've shared. Any of you that's gone through the Sustainable Food Places award process and perhaps also our grant reporting, you, especially when you get to the silver level, these things become critically important to start to be able to evidence and to document, because this is where that added value comes. And this is what we really encourage you to be telling us about in your awards process, certainly by the time you get to silver, because we want to see that added value of the food partnership. And here's where the added value comes. So this is the information that's really important for you to start to track. Start to think about how you can measure the intangibles, those connections that you made, things that might not seem like a big deal at the time, but might turn out to be a big deal later on down the road. So that's what I suggest that you start to do. Is start tracking your activity, start tracking your impact, start thinking about how you can make little notes around those things that might at the time not seem like a big deal. Think about those little bits of coordination that you do and just make a note. Keep it as simple as that. And the emphasis here is on simplicity, because I know how overstretched and work that many of you are, of course, with the tremendous work that you do and difficult work that you do as a food partnership coordinator. So you've got to keep it simple, right? Let's make it as easy as possible for ourselves, but do make a note. Make a brief note of what you've done, when you did it, and with whom. Keep it like that and start making a log of it. So just enough information to capture that activity, because it becomes much easier to track back the activity that you've recorded rather than to try and remember it. Certainly when you get to the case when you're writing your awards application, you forget all of that work that you've done, and you might forget all of that kind of slightly more nuanced aspect of space. But then, of course, you want to provide space for understanding where that's led to. And we'll talk about that in just a second. And so some top tips from the SFP award holders, those that have gone on to gold and silver, start that process early. Really start that process early. Start doing it right now and doing it in the most light touch way that you can. And it will make your job so much easier, not just in the SFP awards process, but any of your funding applications moving forward, any of your stakeholder engagement, which you'll have a wealth of information there to pull from. And please do not undervalue the significance of those connecting and convening role that you all do. It's very important. It's what we're here for. One way that I recommend doing this, and some of you might have been to another webinar that I've done on creating an evidence database. We've done so for Sustainable Food Places more generally. This is just one approach to doing it. I like to use Airtable. It's free to use up to a point, and you can create these very simple forms that you can use for submission. So which allows you to very, very quickly write something down, submit it, and it's automatically logged into a database. And over time, that database builds into something really quite impressive. Do click, but the screens will be shared, the slides will be shared later, and you'll be able to click on those links and explore that. Do go on our website if you're interested in seeing the other webinars we've done in terms of, we did a step-by-step process of building that database. So there's more resources there for you to explore should you wish. So what do you do with all that data then? So you've started to get this activity log, and that's interesting and exciting in and of itself. Well, what that really allows us to do is then keep track of our involvement in our partners' impact. So if our partners go out and deliver some fantastic work as a result of our engagement with them or continued engagement with them, and perhaps they're doing their own evaluation, perhaps it's the local authority and they've got some money to spend on some really good impact evaluation. And we know that we were a part of that. And having been able to start tracking our activity in that space, we're now able to start to really evidence our role there. And we're able to start to ask those questions. For example, what happens if we weren't there? Would this have happened? Would it happen differently? Would it have been less impactful? So we can start to use that data to do a whole range of different sort of methodologies and approaches. And you might have heard of some of them. Some of them are getting quite popular, this idea of sort of ripple effect mapping. These processes where we sort of trace back from an impact and say, okay, what were the components that led to this? And by having that resource that we've created, well, we're able to start to evidence that. It's also a fantastic way, as hopefully some of you have used the SFP evidence database. It's a great way of starting to track information that you can share with others. Because when you start to see those impacts unfolding from your activity, then you've already got sort of mini case studies, certainly of what you did, so that it can be shared with others, so others can start to replicate some of that activity that you did on the ground. And small activities do add up to big impact over time. And being able to think about then that causal chain over the long term and look back 2 years ago when you did something and now you're seeing some impact can be really important. The other thing that can be useful, and this is something I've just thrown in again from my conversation with Hannah and this collective impact forum that she recommended I have a look at. The other thing that you can do is you can use this activity log as a way of evaluating your own performance of that backbone function in particular. And here from that organization, Collective Impact, this is the approach that they have to thinking about different indicators that can start to show you whether you're actually doing a good job at that backbone function. And there's a whole list here of things that you can start to sort of tick off, if you like, and you can use your activity data to be able to do that. And yeah, so I'll leave you to have a look through that in the slides and have a look on the resources, but just wanted to highlight that there as another option to be using your activity data for to start to evaluate the backbone function of your work. So that's that first attribution problem then. That difficulty of working in partnership and not really being able to highlight our role in that space. Well, now we're starting to get to a point where we can highlight our role. We've got an activity log, we can be clear about what it is that we're doing and start to look at where that leads to. So let's move on then to the second of those attribution problems. The tricky beast, as I'm sure you're all well aware, is how do we start to measure systems change and how do we start to measure our role within systems change? Incredibly difficult thing to do, and there's no doubt about that, but we're trying to work out ways in which we can move closer to it. Because that's what our work's about, right? That's what we're here for. We're here to make changes to this. We're here to make changes to the food system. If you haven't seen this graphic before, I love this graphic. I use it for teaching all the time. Centre for Food Policy's food system graphic, a nice, simple way of looking at the complexity of that. But our work, generally speaking, is around trying to make changes to the food chain, the way that we produce, the way that we consume, the way that we market, and everything else involved in that process. Make changes in there, as well as, of course, changes to government and changes to policy to be able to bring about these wider changes in health and the economy and society, environment, and politics. So where's our role in that? What do food partnerships do in this complexity? How are we interacting with that food system? And where are those sort of that links between, where is that causal chain of our activity and some of those impacts and outcomes that we're seeking to bring about? So again, we can look at our theory of change causal model and start to ask, okay, so what are those activities, outputs and outcomes and impacts in relation to our work? Well, we've already looked at activities. We've been talking about activities in the last section. That's where our activities tend to fall. Our activities tend to fall in making changes to the food system. They also, of course, fall in other aspects too, not least making changes to policy. So what can we measure there? Well, we've already started that measurement process with thinking about how we track our activity. So we're well underway with doing that. Then when you think about the outputs of our activity, which is slightly more complicated, of course, but that's where that impact framework comes in. The outputs are that we're coordinating things more, we're instigating things, we're amplifying things, we're delivering things. And that kind of falls on that middle ground between the food chain and these other aspects of the food system that we're looking to engage in. What are the outcomes then? Well, the outcomes really are what fall into these circles. So the outcomes are, of course, things like improving health outcomes, improving health and well-being of people through food. It might be improving access to healthy and nutritious food. It might be aspects of improving the climate. It might be thinking around increasing biodiversity, improving sustainable agricultural outcomes. And then, of course, the impact of our work is making significant changes to those whole fields together. We want to improve the health system. We want to make the environment better in a large scale. We want to reduce the impacts of climate change. So what can we measure there then, is the question. Well, let's do a worked example to think that through. I think this might be the best way of thinking through those different things, those different tangibles that we might be able to measure in relation to our work at a systems level. So let's think about health for a second. Let's say that we have this lofty ambition, which is to improve physical and mental health and well-being by reducing food poverty, improving access to affordable, healthy food, promoting healthy weight and healthy diets, and increasing participation in food-related physical and social activity. That's our impact goal. That's our ambition. It's a vision, as someone pointed out earlier, in many ways. Well, what's measurable from that? Well, in theory, what's measurable are some of those outcomes. If we go back to here and look at health, and we look at, okay, so we're going to look at perhaps some measures around diet and nutrition, perhaps well-being, perhaps access, and we can start to come out with some of these measurables. And I do little quotation marks because they're not necessarily easily measurables, but they are in theory measurable for us. So we can see a decrease in number of people requiring emergency food aid, for example, is one way of thinking about some of the things that we can measure. Decrease in the number of people being overweight or obese, a decrease in the number of people suffering from being malnourished, a decrease in consumption, the list goes on. These are things that we can measure, and we can measure the changes in our environment. So in our local authority area, in our place, we can start to track those things. So we can start to say, okay, perhaps we can access that data, and we'll talk about accessing data in just a second. But we can start to see those changes. So perhaps over time, we notice that there is a decrease in the number of people requiring emergency food aid. Fantastic, great. Decrease in the number of people that are suffering from issues associated with being overweight. Fantastic. What we're still not really able to do from those outcomes, though, is really address that cause and effect. Because there's a big gap between our activity on the ground and those changes. And there could be all sorts of reasons within a food system that those things change. So how do we then talk about the work of Food Partnership and our partners in bringing about those changes? What's the sort of middle ground that we can measure that can show us that there's sort of a middle step in between that we can evidence that we were a part of? And this is where a little bit more jargon busting, if you like, or this introduction to an idea comes in, is that we might not be able to directly measure the difference, what happens because of our activity and the outcome that it leads to. But there are things in between that we can measure. We might want to think of these as, you might call them like a proxy variable or a proxy indicator. And what this means is that while we might not be able to measure that causation directly, we can measure that in-between thing that gives us an indication, gives us an approximation for that change that we're looking to see in the world. So it's an indirect measure. Approximate briefly, represent a phenomena without necessarily measuring it directly. And the best way of thinking about that is if X happens, Y is also more likely to happen. We'll provide some examples to clarify that in a second. A way of thinking about this, and this might be terminology that you're more familiar with perhaps, is that these things operate as kind of a lever for change. Is that if, as a food partnership, we deliver something that is quite tangible and measurable for us, we're more likely to see these grander, bigger impact changes in the world. So let's explore that in terms of our worked example. So what's some proxy variables then for thinking through the gap between our activity on the ground and those outcomes that we're starting to see? Well, one of them, a nice simple one that is very easy for us to measure, and of course we use at Sustainable Food Places, is that, well, if there's a multi-agency partnership established that is aiming to strategically address this full range of issues, well, it's much more likely that we're going to start to see those outcomes, and we're going to start to tie those outcomes to that activity. Of course, we know that if certain policies get created that focus on adopting healthy food in its various manifestations, if they're adopted and if they're enacted, then it's much more likely that we're going to see those. If there's a range of healthy weight eating services, healthy eating and healthy weight services, well, then it's more likely that we're going to see positive outcomes. Again, those of you that have done the SFP awards progression know that these are the sort of things that we want to see evidenced, because these we know are the sort of the levers of change that bring about those wider changes. And the reason that we introduce those to you here is because lots of those bigger metrics, those bigger outcomes that we've talked about are not necessarily in the remit for a food partnership to measure. Those things can be difficult to measure. They can be time consuming. They can require a lot of data skills and knowledge and can require a lot of resources. Whereas these kind of intermediaries, these proxy variables, these levers for change might be more tangible for you to measure. It might be more tangible for you and your partners to keep track of. And that is exactly what some food partnerships are doing. So this is an example then from Bristol and their Bristol Good Foods 2030 strategy. And they've been going through a process of doing this, of thinking through those different indicators, those different tangibles within their realm that are actually measurable for them, that give an indication of the direction of travel, that suggests we're moving in that direction and provide us with a foundation to say, we've done something, it's very clear that we've done something, and we can start to see that causal chain having a result. And this is just one example of how they've done it, and this is just one page. It's on their website, so please do go and have a look. I'm sure you'd be free to reach out to them if you want to talk about how they came about that. The collaborative process that they did with their steering group and the broader set of stakeholders involved in that strategy locally. And working through that process of what is it that we can realistically measure that gives us an indication, gives us a proxy indication of the sort of the levers of change that might bring about our vision for the 2030 strategy. We've also been doing this, and some of you might have been involved in this. It happened over the last couple of years and will be released as a part of the toolkit. We went through a collaborative process with a lot of coordinators, some of whom might be in the room today, of working out a whole list of those proxy indicators of things that you can measure, of things that you can record as you move through. And as I say, we'll release that in its entirety. It's just a foundation. It's not complete. These things are always evolving and need to adapt over time. But give you a list of those different things that you can start to record. It's also really important for this to be very specific to your context. So perhaps this might give you a foundation for thinking through that framework of how do we start to measure systems changes and what things are realistic for us to measure in that process. So who collects that data then? Because that's a big bit of work, isn't it? Collecting all that data. I mean, there's all sorts of many different data sources. It's covering the whole food system. For many of you in the room who no doubt will be struggling with time and resources, how do you do that? How do you build the capacity and capability to be able to do that? Well, you might not be able to, but your partners might. And actually, if we go back up to the Bristol one, you'll notice that on this example, they've got named organizations for that data collection process. And you'll see BCC here, the Bristol City Council, are those that are expected to supply that data. Because, of course, councils do often have access to a lot of data. They have the resources to do so. And just a few examples on the screen there of the different resources that are open source access to many in terms of their local authorities. But perhaps it's not just the local authority that's collecting data. Maybe some of your food banks and those working in providing food security are collecting data. Perhaps they're already doing that. Perhaps they're already collecting data on who's using their food bank, what the usage rates are, and how they've changed. So your role isn't necessarily to go out and collect all that data, but food partnerships can play a really important role in that coordinating, that collecting, and that consolidation of data from partner organizations, that bringing together. So if we go back to our list of some of those indicators, it might not be your responsibility to collect data on each one of those, but it might be a good option for food partnerships to be able to consolidate that, to bring that together, so you can create that coherent picture of full systems working. It's not an easy thing. And I want to be upfront with that as somebody who's spent his life chasing people on surveys and questionnaires and trying to collect data from people. It's not an easy role for a food partnership to take on that responsibility as being sort of data collector and convener. But there's a few tips really that might help you in that process if you do want to embark on playing that role. One of those is to incentivize. There's different ways of doing that. One of those might just be making a really compelling case to your partners as to what difference it will make when you start to consolidate that data, that this will support their work, that this will help make the case for the changes that we're seeing in the food system. There's other ways of doing that. At Sustainable Food Places, we offer to platform information, for example. Tell us about the amazing work that you're doing. helps us make the case for you as a partnership, the value of partnership working, the value of the program, but then also we'll platform it for you. We'll use our social media channels to be able to elevate that and amplify that and share that. One way of sort of encouraging data collection. Make it as simple as possible. People are time poor in our sector, of course. So you need to make it as streamlined and as easy as possible. Of course, we can go back to that database webinar, which is one example of how you do that. Make it as easy, make it as light touch as humanly possible, and that will hopefully will increase the likelihood that people will pass that data on to you. You can also necessitate it though, and this I do recommend, especially as we move forward and think more about data in the work of our food partnerships. And by that I mean adding clear and accountable data expectations to your partnerships agreements. Have it up front, have it agreed up front that there is an expectation that we all submit data to each other, and perhaps that the food partnership plays a role in consolidating that. The last 2 points might seem a little bit contradictory, and I guess to some extent they are. Diversify and standardize. Well, when I say diversify, what I mean is that the ways in which we collect data differ substantially between what organization we are and the kind of work that we do and the kind of resources that we have. So we need to be open for those different opportunities to collect data. But we need to be open to be having sort of more creative ways of collecting data. Perhaps one of your organizations, the only thing they're able to do is collect some testimonials from their service users. That's great. That's valuable information that we should encourage and collect. Perhaps it's about more creative methods. Perhaps people are telling their experience of working with an organization through artistic means or creative means, as well as, of course, the sort of the more quantitative measures. And that's where the standardized bit comes in most importantly, is that when you are talking about quantitative data, it is a good idea to agree standardized metrics, standardized ways of measuring things, because it makes that job of combining and comparing and contrasting a lot easier. So have those agreements in place for how that data, certainly when it comes to sort of a local authority and there's different departments involved and the different ways that they're collecting data, to standardize across that is very helpful for making the case and being able to consolidate and collect that information. So there you have it. There's the 2 approaches to addressing that sort of twin attribution problem. So we've talked about working in partnership and we talked about evidencing system change. So when we're working in partnership, we need to start thinking about being clear with the added value that we bring to that space, clear about that backbone function, clear about some of those sort of more intangible activities, and starting to be able to create a framework for tracking them. Start tracking them, start making a note, and then think about how we can use that information to evidence our role when we start to see subsequent impacts from our partners. Start to think about how we can track back and say we were involved in that, and we can show that we were involved in that. In that evidencing systems change, well, the key is to start thinking about what realistically is measurable within that space. What can you measure and what can your partners measure? You might not be able to go every step of the way, and you might not be able to always show that sort of clear causal chain, but you might be able to start finding these kind of proxy variables, these things that we know intrinsically to some extent that if we do this, things are going to get better, things are going to be going to improve. And then thinking about how as a food partnership, it's not a role for every food partnership, but some food partnerships might want to think, is there a role for us in here to be a bit of the coordinator, consolidator, and convener of data? And then thinking about some of those ways in which we can incentivize and we can bring that about for our partners. Is that another space for added value for us of being able to not just coordinate action, but coordinate some of that evidence and make that sort of coherent, compelling case at a systems level? So a real whistle-stop tour. Lots of concepts covered, and as I mentioned, we're going to be there's a toolkit to be released likely next week, if not the week after, which will have more information and have those signposts so you can go and explore things in more detail. An evolving problem that we're all grappling with, and there is no easy solutions for any of these kind of cause and effect challenges that we face. But yeah, if there's things that would be great for you to take away, if you haven't got a theory of change, go away, do that, think about that, take to your steering group and think through that process. If you're not tracking your data, if you're not tracking your activity, really do start doing that as soon as possible. Keep it simple, keep it brief, but just start making little notes to yourself around what you've done, when you've done it, and with whom. I'll open the floor now. We've got about 5 minutes left to any questions, but I also wanted to open the space for anyone to share some of the information or some things that they've been doing in their partnerships. Perhaps you've been approaching this in a very different way. No problem with that at all. So yeah, just open the floor really to any questions or any comments and feedback around on what they're doing, what you're doing in relation to some of this work. Andrea, I don't know if there's any questions in the chat as well that you wanted to.
No questions in the chat at the minute. So that'd be great if people just want to share. Yeah, also just to invite, if you've got links or visuals or anything you've used or found useful, it'd be great if you threw that in the chat as well.
Yeah, any resources that you use, perhaps any websites that you've come across, because and if you want to email me them afterwards as well, I can make sure they're included in the toolkit as it gets finalized over the next week.